In this lesson, we are going to take a deeper look at interim assessments and their purpose in a comprehensive assessment system. Notice that the daily and weekly formative assessments are located at the narrow end of the assessment cone, and the annual summative assessments are situated at the opposite end of the cone. The assessments that occupy the area in between weekly and annual assessments, unit and quarterly, serve as forms of interim assessment. So what are interim assessments, and how are they different from the annual summative assessments and the daily formative assessments? In their 2010 policy brief on benchmark assessments, Herman, Osmundson, and Dietl proposed the following definition of interim assessments. Interim assessments are assessments administered periodically throughout the school year at specified times during a curriculum sequence to evaluate students' knowledge and skills relative to an explicit set of longer-term learning goals. The design and choice of interim assessments is driven by the purpose, intended users, and uses of instruments. Interim assessment can inform policy, instructional planning, and decision-making at the classroom, school, and/or district levels. There are 3 key points to notice about interim assessments. First, interim assessments are administered several times during the year, typically 3 or 4 times, and usually at the end of a period of instruction, for example, after several weeks or months. Second, interim assessments are intended to inform educational decisions. For example, a teacher may use an interim assessment to identify areas of weakness, for example, student difficulties with fraction and decimal conversions, and use this information to address areas of need. Third, interim assessments allow for aggregation across students, occasions, or concepts. For example, districts could use aggregated interim data to evaluate patterns and trends in student performance school by school. Keep these ideas in mind as we will explore these tenets more deeply throughout the lesson. The diagram on this slide from Perry et al. Helps explain the differences among formative, interim, and summative assessment within a comprehensive assessment system, and does so in terms of scope and frequency, or, put another way, in terms of different assessment cycles, long, medium, and short. The 3 assessment types operate within these different assessment cycles. Summative assessments are long cycle assessments. They cover a longer period of teaching and learning than interim and formative, and are intended to sum up a period of learning to indicate what learning has been achieved. They are often used for accountability purposes, for placement, and certification. Interim assessments are medium cycle assessments, typically administered several times each year, usually school or district-wide. Interim assessments can be used for instructional, evaluative, or predictive purposes, and we will discuss these different purposes later in this lesson. Because formative assessment can occur multiple times in the course of a lesson, they operate in a short assessment cycle. Teachers and students use the evidence from these assessments to adjust ongoing teaching and learning while the learning is occurring. Individual teachers decide how, with whom, and when to use formative assessment. Now let's take a moment to revisit the idea of a comprehensive assessment system and look at how these assessments function together. This diagram, similar to the cone we viewed earlier, shows how the different assessments work together and also build on each other. As Herman, Osmundson, and Dietl explain, the learning targets assessed by frequent classroom formative assessment contribute to the long-term targets addressed by periodic benchmark assessments. Benchmark data flows into the annual assessment, which in turn transfers into subsequent years of teaching, learning, and assessment. As a note of clarification, Herman et al. Refer to interim assessments by the term benchmark because interim assessments gauge progress along the way to the ultimate learning goal. For this same reason, you may also hear interim assessment referred to as quarterly assessment, progress monitoring, medium cycle, and medium scale assessment. With this understanding of the differences in assessment types and how they support each other, we are now going to look more closely at the specific purposes of interim assessments, including how they are used and by whom, depending on the intended purpose. In their research, Perry et al. Identified 3 main purposes for interim assessments: instructional, evaluative, and predictive. For example, an interim assessment intended for instructional purposes might be used to adapt curriculum and instruction in the current school year. With interim assessments, teachers and administrators can identify areas of weakness in student performance and take action during the current school year. It is important here to recognize the limitations of interim assessment for ongoing instructional purposes. Because interim assessments cover several weeks or months of instruction, it is not possible to use the results for planning day-to-day, week-by-week instruction. This is the role of formative assessment, which we will discuss later in the course. Interim assessment intended for evaluative purposes might be used to evaluate the effectiveness of a particular program or curriculum, and therefore provide information to change instruction in future school years. Interim assessment intended for predictive purposes might be used to determine how a student might perform on the end-of-year tests. Recall from Lesson 1, a central concern in assessment data quality is that the assessment is used for its intended purpose. When considering interim assessment, you will need to make sure that the assessment has been designed for the specific purpose you have in mind. For example, to use the assessment for predictive purposes, the assessment must be designed for this specific purpose. Now we'll take a moment to consider how interim assessments can inform the various levels of decision makers, the state, district, school, and classroom levels. State and district level personnel might want to use interim assessments for evaluative or predictive purposes. For example, in looking at the effectiveness of a school or district's improvement plan, or to predict how students might perform on the end-of-year summative assessment. At the school level, administrators could use interim assessments designed for evaluative or instructional purposes. For example, to determine the effectiveness of newly adopted curricula or programs, or to identify which students are falling behind and need extra support. Finally, teachers and students at the classroom level can also find interim assessments helpful at an aggregated level to look for patterns across the class to determine areas where students need additional help toward meeting the grade level expectations. Just as the intended purpose of a particular assessment helps to inform who can benefit from its use, the purpose of an assessment also determines how it will be used effectively. Marianne Perry and her colleagues suggest considering the following when thinking about how to design or choose an appropriate interim assessment. First, consider, what do I want to learn from this assessment? Second, who will use this information gathered from the assessment? Third, what action steps will be taken as a result of this assessment? Fourth, what professional development or support structures should be in place to ensure the action steps are taken appropriately? And finally, how will student learning improve as a result of using this interim assessment system? And will it improve more than if the assessment system were not used? Keeping these questions in mind can help ensure that you are using an assessment for the intended purpose and will help you make effective use of the results. In addition to asking yourself the questions we just identified to determine if assessment is appropriate for use for the purpose you intend, there are some key considerations we learned about in Lesson 1 to keep in mind when selecting and using interim assessments. First of all, it is essential that the assessment is aligned with the content standards and learning goals. As we learned in Lesson 1, this is a key consideration in assessment quality. Secondly, it may be necessary for users to have professional development aimed at increasing capacity for effectively developing or selecting, administering, and interpreting results from the interim assessments. Even if the assessment is extremely well designed for the intended purpose, it will fail to assist in bringing about improvement if educators do not have the proper tools and skills available to administer and interpret the results from the assessment. A final consideration for interim assessment is to make sure that they add value to the assessment system. If they do not add value, then they do not warrant the time and money associated with their use. For example, if you are using mini versions of the annual state tests, they are unlikely to contribute information beneficial to improving student learning, unless they have been designed for predictive purposes, and there is evidence to show that they are valid for this purpose. If they are going to be used for progress monitoring, then they must measure the same construct over all the administrations during the year. For example, if you want to use them to measure progress in reading comprehension, then they must measure the construct of reading comprehension at each administration. As with the image of the rock stairs on the right, You will want to ensure that any interim assessment you choose is strategically designed and placed within a comprehensive assessment system, rather than haphazardly thrown atop a jumbled pile of assessments. The work cited in this lesson is shown here. For more information on interim assessment and how it fits into a comprehensive assessment system, you can reference these articles or click on the logo to access the AACC's Data Use website. You will now complete a short activity to check your understanding of interim assessment use. When you have finished, you will be ready to move on to Lesson 3. You have now completed Lesson 2. Please continue on to Lesson 3, Applying the Data Analysis Framework to Interim Assessments.